Yeah, hold on.
Maybe we get our first speaker going while that's going on? Or is it our first speaker?
Bob's our first speaker.
Ah,
Let me just start.
Okay.
All right. All right. We were going to go to the next slide, I think. So I'm Bob Hinden. I'm the Commodore of Pack Cup for this race. I wanted to welcome everyone to the town hall about ratings. We are doing something different this year where we are allowing boats to select which rating system they want to race under. Previously, we just sort of did it by size or speed. And we got a lot of requests from a lot of double handers who would have preferred to race under ORR at the end of the last race. So we are trying this out. And the other new thing relating to ORR is the weather-based for rating system, which is what we'll talk about a lot tonight. So I've at least had the personal experience in some pack cups of both on the day I started having it be very light and but later in the week um, it got windy and then I've also had the reverse where the early starts were very windy and in this case the small boats did very well and then the larger boats at the end, it was much lighter. So we got very different results and for all the overall trophies. So I'm very optimistic that the weather-based ORR ratings will actually even that out. So the overall winners it'll be a much fairer race for everyone who is an ORR. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this all plays out. So, Buzz, do you want to
Sure.
continue?
Thanks, Bob. And again, welcome everybody. I think we're going to have a really informative program. Tonight we've got some expert speakers and we've got a lot to cover. First, a couple of things before we get started on the substance. Get going. If there's one message that I want people to take away from tonight, it's that the process of getting your boat uh, rated and ready for the race can take time and organization and follow through. And although we're, 10 and a half months from our start, it's time. So you need to figure out, if you haven't already, what fleet you want to race in. And you need to make arrangements, if you're going to get weighed and measured, to get that done. And you need to be mindful of the deadline for submitting rating applications either to YRA if you're going PHRF or to US Sailing if it's ORR. So please don't put this off. It can lead to your frustration and the frustration of people on the Pack Cup side, as well as the rating authorities. Other thing is, I want to make sure that everybody, if they haven't already, takes time to read both the notice of race and, more importantly for our topic tonight, the ratings, frequently asked questions. We put some time and effort into making that a pretty complete document. It's pretty easy to navigate your way through if you have particular questions. And if you have particular questions that don't get answered either tonight or during the process, you can get to the experts that you need to, starting maybe with your inspector, and moving on to the chief inspector and the technical committee, if need be. Questions for tonight. Because we've got a lot to cover, we'd like everybody to submit their questions either in the chat box or the Q&A box. But we'd like to wait to answer most questions until we get through the material. If you think your question needs to be answered right at the moment, you can so indicate when you type it in. Next slide. All right, so what are we going to cover tonight? We're going to start out with Jim Antrim talking about the PAC Cup rating history. His slides are remarkable. As you'll see, he's been keeping careful track of what we've been doing right from the beginning. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about our two fleet structure. And then Stan Honey's going to talk about the origins, development, and goals for the new ORR system of forecast time correction factors. And then Michael Marazda and Jim Teeters will talk to us about the mechanics of how that system is going to work for the ORR fleet and the communication, the way the communications are going to be set up. And lastly, those two, joined by other people from our technical committee, can talk about how FTCF has worked in other races, if there are any lessons to be learned that we will try to incorporate, and then the Q&A. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jim Antrim. I think everybody locally at least knows Jim, a prolific, successful yacht designer, a veteran PAC Cup competitor, a wonderful historian of the PAC Cup, and a member of the PHRF committee. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Can go to the next slide already. When I was asked to review the history of the PHRF I sort of got curious, what did we do in the early days? So I dug out the results of the first races, and the first race, which we call the first Pacific Cup, was called the Kauai race, went to Willie Harbor on Kauai. And I was surprised to see there was two divisions that were, you sailed under both IOR and PHRF, so you could win either class or either rating, essentially. And so 5 divisions total. And then IOR continued for the first 5 races. There was 1 division of IOR and all subsequent races of those 5. IOR, for those who aren't familiar, was a formulaic rule, kind of followed the CCA rule before it, which you enter a bunch of numbers and you come out with a rating. And anyway, it kind of went out of style in around 1990. So I thought it was interesting. Merlin entered all 4 of these first races and won the first one, and then sort of was back at the bottom of the fleet, most of the rest ones. 1988, the finish line moved to Kaneohe. I was trying to remember when all these first races were sailed under straight PHRF, that is to say, what we now call the buoy rating, that the normal PHRF you get in the bay. And I know that we instituted a correction formula for downwind ratings at some point. And, I talked to Jim Kornman. So it was Jim Kornman and Carl Shoemaker who came up with this idea. And I worked with them to develop the first formula. And so Jim thought it was in the mid-80s, which seemed right to me, but he also thought it came in right after the West Sail 32 Saraband won the PHRF division, and I think overall gutted West Sail 32. And so anyway, these formulas were put in that corrected for displacement length ratio, and I'll talk about those corrections later. Next slide, please. So the subsequent years were all PHRF, no other rating roles involved. And those were all sailed with this first formula correction on the downwind formulas. I mean, on the straight PHRF. That I'll show you what those are like later on here. But at the end of this period, I changed the formula a little bit in 2004. But my internet connection is unstable, it says here. Okay.
I can hear you fine and see you.
Okay. Anyway, you know, it's all PHRF, and they all used that original formula correction that Carl and Jim Cornman and I came up with. And I think that's still what's used for the single-handed Transpac. So next slide. In the 2004 race, we introduced AmeriCap. And AmeriCap was a VPP rule, a velocity prediction program that later on became ORR. Started out as the MHS system derived in the 70s. That was among the first velocity prediction program formulas. So we introduced AmeriCap that year, had 2 AmeriCap divisions, 4 PHRF divisions in crude boats, and 1 double-handed division. The following year, I fiddled with the downwind adjustment formula a little bit, because just looking at past results, it seems like heavy boats were still losing all the time. Following couple years were AmeriCap, and then AmeriCap became ORR for the 2010 race. And so in 2010, I sort of got the feeling that the downwind corrections were just not enough. And we developed the downwind rating system that we use now. And so that's kind of carried on ever since. And next slide. So these are the original adjustment formulas. The first one here is the displacement length ratio thing that was original in '94 and carried on until the 2006 race. And so you can see that a displacement length ratio of 100, you start getting a little break, and at 150 it gets a little more, and then by the time you're 200, you're heavy enough and you don't get any more. So in 2006, I made that a little bit stronger. And the length factor is sort of similar. It essentially corrects for a boat that has a slow rating to its hull length. In other words, it sails slower than its hull speed might be. So boats that were sort of heavy sort of benefited from both of those corrections. Slide. So these are the reasons I came up with the idea that the PHRF adjustment formula just wasn't good enough. We started seeing these boats with lots of sail area, planing for long distances, the Riptide 35s, which were also water ballasted, just kicked ass in 1998. There were two of them. They came in first and second in their club, beating all the Santa Cruz 50s and 52s by quite a bit. And that was basically a PHRF error. didn't give them enough hurt there. My 27 won its class in 2000, 2002, 2006. TP52s were showing up on the scene, boats like that. So these are boats with powerful rigs, bulb keels. And I just realized I fooled around trying to adjust the formulas some more, or adding some of the sail area correction. And I ended up, with the committee, deriving a system, using, numerical analysis of the previous races. We took all the boats that had, elapsed times only, and used basically the only boats that came in first through third in their class. So we assumed they were all well sailed, and derived this downwind formula we use today. And it's pretty complicated. But then in 2013, we changed. Originally it was like PHRF numbers. And you'd be sub-zero if you're fast and sort of thing. But we thought it was derived originally to estimate the actual average time the boat would take on the course. So that comes out to a seconds per mile kind of answer. And so in 2013, we switched it to that, just dropped the correction from that and left. So now it's really is supposed to directly relate to the average speed you're going to sail on the course. Next slide. So we learned some things by doing this. Sort of the obvious thing is displacement and effective sailing length are huge factors in how fast a boat goes. And but PHRF is based on, at that time, totally based on whatever people filled out in their certificate. So, usually the waterline length was the, designer's brochure thing, and the same with the displacement. So actual boats are, they generally lie about both of those things. So actual boats are generally a lot heavier, and the length waterline is not particularly significant, because flat overhangs can make your effective length a lot longer. So anyway, we started with this formula, and then we realized our database was completely full of errors, because the normal PHRF ratings are based on a bunch of guys sitting around talking about it, and oh, that's an Express 37 and it's like the other ones, or it looks similar to this boat, and it's the PHRF ratings are derived by discussion rather than formulas before this. So that's why we started asking people to weigh their boat and measure overhangs, so we'd get more accurate sailing lengths and displacements. And a lot of people think one design is the way to go, but one design racing generally has as much spread between the winners and the losers as PHRF does. And a lot of that is, of course, most of it is skill and going the right way and preparation of the boat, but some of it is due to the variation in weight among one design classes. So that's why we don't often give one design boats the same rating in this race. And it's not like the normal PHRF in that you get, if your pole is 10% longer, you get a 3 per second penalty and so on. And standard PHRF, the PH downwind formula has a graduated penalty that's dependent on how fast we think the boat's going to go. So that if you're a 100-foot boat that hardly ever flies spinnakers, your pull length gets, your bowsprit length gets penalized. Where if you're a heavy boat that really ought to be sailing with spinnaker, symmetric spinnakers and spinnaker poles, a bowsprit length is quite cheap. And anyway, there's a lot of formulas in it that make it work. Next slide. So the advantages of PHRF, it's cheap and easy. Everybody kind of gets the idea. And lots of people that enter this particular race are newbies to the sport, or not necessarily newbies to the sport, but newbies to ocean racing. In fact, that's the first Pacific Cup I did was exactly on that situation. There was a couple that had a cruising boat and they wanted to sail to Hawaii with a group of boats around them to feel safe. They had their two son-in-laws sailing with them, and none of them had ever flown a spinnaker before. So they asked me to go along because I knew them from a project I had done. And anyway, there's a lot of people like that in our race. And I think that's part of the reason it's the fun race to Hawaii. So PHRF is, of course, a single number system, but really so is the ORR, the way we use it, even with the forecast TCF. So once you get your number, it's easy to evaluate where you are during the race. With the downwind formula, it does come out of a formula, but our committee number that comes out of it, and if it seems stupid, we change it. So it is still a PHRF committee number. And of course, it's typically less accurate than VPP. It should be, but when you get a number out of a VPP rating, there's no option to change it if it looks stupid. You have to rewrite the formula somehow and find out why it's not working. Just not the big disadvantage with PHRF, germane to tonight's discussion, is you can't use forecast TCF with it. And I think forecast TCF, great advantage for particularly eliminating these, unequal weather starts that we suffer with all the time. And I think that's the end of my dissertation.
Great.
Oh,
Bob,
no.
are there
Oh,
any
yeah, we got one
questions?
more. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I wanted to show people what they're coming from before this switch to PHRF. I mean, to forecast TCF. So this on the left here is the wind matrix that we used all the way through 2012. And it was just simply, I dreamed up what was sort of a typical race to Hawaii like. And you start out with this very short beat, crack off for a while, you get your kite up a couple days into the race and so on. And the last part of the race is down VMG, although Stan points out correctly that it's not really so much of a VMG race. But anyway, that was the formula we used that goes into a wind matrix, calculates the one number ORR rating for you that we're switching from. And this one on the left was used through 2012. We got a little more sophisticated with a study, and then this other one has been in use through the last race. And since then, Michael Rosita was working on a even better one, but now that forecast cards, that's where we are. So I don't know if you can look at this, but the top one over on the right is exactly the same as the one on the left. It's just changed from distance to percentage of the course kind of thing. And the one in the lower part is what's been used since 2014. Okay, that's it.
All right. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Bob, were there any questions that people thought Jim ought to talk about right now, or should we move on? You're muted.
There's no questions in the Q&A, and I'm not seeing any
right.
questions about Jim's talk in the
All
chat.
right. All right. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
Next slide, Corey. All right. Before we get into the details about ORR and FTCF, I wanted to take a step back and address two very reasonable questions that were raised as soon as we announced our two-fleet structure. And the first question is why two fleets? And we spent a lot of time thinking about this before we decided to go with this new structure. But it boils down to three things, really. PHRF is a performance-based rule. It's subjective, as Jim was just indicating. If something looks dumb, it can be fixed. Whereas ORR, you do a bunch of measurements. Jim Teeters runs them through a computer and generates a velocity prediction program for the boat that then turns into an ORR rating, and it's objective. And I think partly as a result of that basic difference, there's been over the years a natural migration of boats into one or the other of the two fleets based on things like how old the design is when the boat was built, how big it is, whether it's a high performance yacht or more of a cruiser, how much expense was taken in building the boat to keep it light and stiff, and the use of the boats. Most of the boats in our PHRF fleet, people cruise, they're comfortable. Most of the boats in the ORR fleet may not be. And the last thing is that, as has been previously mentioned, because of the different wind conditions on different start dates, trying to pick an overall winner based on PHRF for everybody with some sort of conversion for the ORR boats has had mixed results and mixed reviews given the different weather patterns. Next slide. Second question, can people sign up to race under both PHRF and ORR? And we decided that the answer to that was no. And again, three considerations, the first one being the same, apples and oranges. And the difference between the PHRF rating approach and the ORR rating approach, given the use this time of forecast of FTCF, is probably going to be even greater. And simplicity. We wanted boats in whatever fleet to know who their competition is while racing and not have to worry about some larger group of boats that may have started several days earlier or later. And the last point, and I don't want to accuse anybody of anything, but we don't want ORR skippers during the race to decide to switch the fleets against whom they're competing. And the other thing it can be vice versa if PHRF boats decide maybe they have an advantage over the larger, later starting ORR boats. So next up is Stan to talk about the background of FTCF. It takes often a long time to properly introduce Stan, but I'm going to try to do it in 30 seconds. Stan is a brilliant engineer. He's a highly successful entrepreneur. He's a wildly successful sailor and yachtsman, a world-renowned navigator, and he is uniquely qualified to talk to us about ratings because he is not only on the YRA PHRF committee, but he's also a director on the board of directors at US Sailing. Stan?
Thanks, Buzz. I think you're talking about my evil twin, but let's go ahead. Next slide. So the historical background, and Jim did a great job, but the historical approach is you take a single number system like IOR, or before that CCA, or PHRF, but it's a one-way race. It's a race that's predominantly reaching and running. And so Jim went through the corrections that the Pacific Cup provided. Heavy boats with long water lines reach and run better than expected, but are slow upwind. So they have, a slower one number rating. And then light boats reach and run well, but are slow upwind. And so have a PHRF rating that doesn't reflect that. The Transpac did the same thing. The Transpac in the IOR days, in order to keep the lightweight boats from running away with every race, they had a BDR correction, base displacement ratio, and an SHR, sail hull ratio, that they would put in. And similar to our experience, we're actually worse than our experience in the Pacific Cup. It ended in tears because no matter how many smart people sat around a room, and I was on the Transpac technical committee since 1980, but no matter how many people sat around a room trying to figure out corrections, you couldn't do it as well as a VPP can do it. And so, and there was loopholes that emerged from these corrections. People put in boomkins to make the boat longer. People put aft water tanks that you had to fill under the IOR because they made the boat rate faster, but then they didn't fill them in the downwind race, and they therefore they met the base displacement threshold. And then people bolted lead under the deck. But all of these things were basically symptoms of the fact that we didn't have a VPP that could look at all characteristics of the boat and race that boat and estimate the performance of that boat in the expected weather. And instead, what you had is a bunch of people sitting around trying to figure out how to correct. And at the end of the day, a better approach is to predict the performance of a boat is to actually do it with with science, the way Jim Teeter does it with VPP. Later, the ORR rule, first the AmeriCap, but the ORR rule was introduced based on a VPP, and it predicted the boat's performance at all wind angles and wind speed, far better approach. But the problem was these high resolution predictions, they were very good. And I think most people are impressed with the ORR polars. But all of that science, or not all of that science, much of that science was wasted with a fixed weather assumption, meaning making the assumption that every single start day of every year until the end of time is exactly the same. And so basically it took a lot of that resolution of the VPP and threw it into a mix master with this assumption that the weather never changes. The FTCF takes the approach of using the ORR VPP, but it scores votes with the forecast winds available the morning of each start. And I'll comment on, briefly, because Paul has already asked the question, why do we use the forecast winds? Why don't we use the reanalysis winds after the race, or the F0, initialization time slots after the race? Wouldn't that be better? And I'll answer, why it is that we currently don't do that. Next slide. FTCF scoring. The way to think about it, especially in a race that has multiple starts, is the boat that performs the best relative to its routed time wins. And this is Mrazda's explanation, which I think is the clearest way to understand it. But basically, you take, for every boat, you take you divide the routed estimated time by the actual elapsed time, and then you get a number, and then you sort by that number, and the boats with the highest number wins. And so you don't need to race the race, at the same time in order for that to work. Paul Kamen might point out you don't even need to sail in the same race course for that to work. It just works. You just take the routed elapsed time divided by the actual elapsed time, and then that gives you a performance index. You sort by that, and that determines the winner. The problem with that approach is that it's absolutely baffling for sailors to figure out how they're doing during the race. And one absolute requirement for sailors who want to race one another is to be able to figure out how they're doing relative to each other. So to figure out, who to cover, if they have to cover somebody, figure out, when to split. And so people really do, the sailors, racers really do want to be able to figure out how they're doing. And that's why the PCS approach, which we're not going to go into any detail, but that's why that was so frustrating, in races like the Bermuda race that used PCS, because, I was able to actually figure it out. And there was probably, half a dozen other navigators that could figure it out, but it wasn't easy to figure out your standings. And in fact, sometimes the race organizer struggled to figure out what the standings were. So racers want single TCFs so that they can figure out how they're doing, so that they can race one another. And the single TCF allows easy calculation of who owes who how much during the race. And you're all familiar with doing that because you're familiar with single TCFs from IRC, from PHRF, etc. Now, the interesting thing about the TCF approach is it's different algebra, but it gives you exactly the same results as the Mrazda thought experiment. That's the first point. And we can leave that algebraic proof, for Paul Kamen or for a homework assignment. But the point of this is that the boat gets scored based on its performance relative to its routed performance, but the objective of coming up with a TCF pre-start is to allow racers to race one another and to figure out, when they need to split and figure out who they should cover if they have to cover somebody. Next slide. No forecast is ever correct, but forecasts are better than the assumption that every day's weather is exactly the same as every other day. Andy Clonton, who's a technical guy who works for ORC, and I worked with Andy for several years in an America's Cup project, and he's just got an epic dry wit. But Andy's comment on this dilemma is when he just makes the decision whether to reach for his umbrella when he's going to work each morning, he doesn't check the climatological average weather. He checks the forecast. And it's true that forecasts aren't perfect, but they're way better than the assumption that every day is the climatological average. And the forecasts, frankly, are getting better and better. And Hawaii races have the benefit that the forecasts work extremely well for the first 5 or 6 days, and that's when the weather is the most variable. As you get towards the end of the race, you're in the trades. And there are still differences in the trades, but they're much less pronounced. than the differences, of the start day and the first few days. It's worth pointing out also that this requirement that racers want to have a TCF so that they can race one another, that turns out to be the reason that you have to use the forecast to come up with a TCF before the race, because that's what the sailors want. In principle, you could do the same approach, and you could use the NOAA reanalysis data, or you could use the H0 time slots. Then you could come up with a better estimate of what the weather actually was, and then score the race after the fact. But sailors hate that. In every fleet that I've sailed in, where you don't know who won until after, it just drives people crazy, because they just sail as fast as they can, and then they sit around trying to work out how they did, but they're not actually able to race each other. Next slide. This is an interesting question, and I get asked this quite a bit. Does FTCF scoring impact your strategy? And the answer is no. I could think the actual answer is probably hell no. Your objective is to finish as soon as possible. Use whatever routing tools, whatever forecasts get you to the finish as soon as you can. Divine guidance works too. People ask, gee, do I need, if FTCF is scoring the thing, do I need to take the same route that that Jim Teeters came up with, or do I need to use the same forecast? And the answer is no. You get your FTCF, it's just a single number. Life at that point is simple. Sorry about that, folks. Life at that point is simple. Just get to the finish as soon as you can and take advantage of that single number TCF so you can race the other boats in the race and figure out if you need to cover somebody. Analysis from rescoring previous races with FTCF shows that more of the fleet will be in the hunt for more of the race. It rarely changes the, thank you, Jim. It rarely changes the winner, although sometimes it can, but what it mostly does is it bunches up the fleet. So more of the fleet has more fun. So if you start on an unlucky start day in a Hawaii race, you're not just immediately crushed, you're just kind of slowly crushed over the course of the rest of the race. And it reduces the horses for courses impact, meaning there are races that benefit frankly, the slower boats that tend to do better in lighter air. And there's races that benefit the boats that get up on a plane and, rocket to Hawaii. And the FTCF system, because it takes advantage of the VPP, which predicts the boat's performance, and it takes advantage of the forecast, which isn't perfect, but it's better than the assumption that every race is the same, and it reduces that horses for courses impact. So that concludes my comments, but of course I'll stand around, or I'll wait around for questions.
Bob, were there any that
So
Stan ought to address now?
well, there's one question that I think Michael said he was going to answer live.
That was a misclick. What I was going to say is, I believe Jim will be addressing the question of exactly what weather we're using, and I think he'll address that directly.
Yeah, the question was which of multiple weather forecast models is used for the forecast DCF.
Yeah. So there's a lesson to everybody. Don't click random buttons in a public presentation.
All right. So Jim and Michael, you guys are up next. Short introductions. Michael is, I think, appropriately named Mr. Pacific Cup. He has been heavily involved in the race for years and years, maybe decades. And he has done everything that anyone could possibly ask to support the race. He's done very well in the race. He's currently the webmaster and the effective communications director for this go-round of the race. And he's a longtime successful competitor in this race and the Transpac. Jim Teeters comes to us from the East Coast, so thanks to Jim for being willing to stay up late tonight to join us. Jim is the offshore projects manager at U.S. Sailing. He's, as I think has been indicated before, really the brains behind ORR and FTCF. I think the two of them will be able to help us understand how it's going to work as you prepare to go to the start line for your day in the race. Go ahead, you guys.
Okay, so I'm going to start if we'll go to the next slide. First of all, Jim and I are lucky. Everybody else has been talking about the past and how we got here, and Jim and I get to talk about the future and what we're going to do to make this all work. As Stan mentioned, at the end of the day, in this particular system, what you're going to get is one number, the FTCF number. And that is going to basically be used no differently than we've been using time on time TCF numbers for, golly, a good 15 years or so for Pat Cup and somewhat longer in local racing. The nice thing about TCF in the first place is it, well, for race organizers, you don't need to worry about how long the course is. And second, it provides something of an adjustment. If the wind goes light, everybody slows down. If the wind goes heavy, everybody speeds up. So the process we're going to have, and Jim is going to describe this next step, is U.S. Sailing does the math. They're gonna run your polars up against the weather forecast and come up with how long they think it's going to take you. And then we'll take that number and convert it to a TCF number in surprisingly simple arithmetic. And the plan is the morning of the race, we're going to give you a few things. First thing we're going to give you is your TCF number. Well, that's very exciting, but what you need is the TCF number of your competitors. You need that because you want to know how you're doing. You need that because you want to know if you're that kind of a sailor, who to cover, who to follow, and get a sense of how they're doing as well. So we're going to provide you that TCF number as a multiplier for your elapsed time. To make your life easier and to make it easier to calculate in your head, we're going to give you that number as well, calculated as minutes per day. There's a few ways to think about it, and we'll explain that more in detail as we get there. And we'll give you a spreadsheet to give you a sense of, how much do you need to beat Lucky Duck in real time to beat them. And that's kind of fun. On our side, while you're out there, we'll be getting your positions by YB Tracker and other means. And as they dribble in, we will update the standings on the website several times per hour, actually. We normally only have to do it once an hour, every half hour, but sometimes those position reports come in a little late. That information will be delayed with the same delay that we provide tactically for the boats, so that for most of the race, that'll be 4 hours. And that'll get emailed to the competitors a couple times a day. You can also reach out either by email or just by going to the website with your Starlink, whatever you've got, and we'll get that information as well. So that is everything I'm going to do. And turn it over to Jim.
Well, thank you, Michael, and it's my pleasure to be here. It's not even 11 o'clock, so. My first slide is just to explain the procedures that we go through at the offshore office. In advance of the event, we will create expedition polar files from the ORR BPP output files. These are the same as on your certificate, with the exception that your certificate polars do not include the effects of the Pacific swell factor. We use that for the Transpac race, and to the best of my knowledge, that's what's going on for Pacific Cup as well next year. So it's just a simple expedition file, which is a polar table. Ahead of time, we set up the expedition course, exclusion zones, so we don't sail over land, pick up tides and other settings, how the optimization is going to work, time stepping and so on. Because we're going to be doing a fleet run, since we need to do this very quickly, Stan has educated me, Stan Honey. I guess there's only one Stan, never mind. on how to write batch XML files for Expedition. So this works really quickly. I have a laptop from 2017 with 4 cores. The way Nick White has set it up, it executes 4 boats at a time. So it works very quickly, and that gives me more flexibility in the morning. So in that morning, we'll download a GFS, and the H, there's one R missing in that HRRR, but whatever. We download that H file the day of the start. We do a fleet run of the starters in the morning. I like to archive the fleet elapsed times because that's what goes into the ratings, but also individual boat logs. And I will save graphic images of the fleet optimal routes. It's just a really good diagnostics feature, especially if we want to go back and take a look at something. I like to have information at my fingertips. In fact, I have been using those individual boat logs to get a better understanding of what Expedition thinks happens during a race. We calculate FTCF as the ratio of a scratch boat elapsed time to that of each boat. Now, we've been using a specific boat to do this, just so that we have consistency from one time on time rating to another in ORR. That it's also truthful that we could just pick a number. We didn't have to do something like a Varuna in Transpac. We could just pick a certain seconds per mile times the number of miles to come up with an elapsed time to be used for generating FTCFs. Because in the end, all that does is carry the ratings from one group to another, one vote to another. It's like a transfer function. Last thing is email the race committee with a spreadsheet of FTCFs, and we often include the predicted elapsed times. For some of the races that are a shorter duration, it gives them a better idea of when they might expect people to cross the line. Next slide, please. So let's go do some rescoring here. This is a Transpac 23, which was run with a single number time on time using the Transpac rating that you currently see on an ORR certificate. It was not FTCF. So those results are shown with the blue lines. I've got the fleet stretched out horizontally from Pelagroso on the far left to Insight 2 on the far right. They are grouped by start days. So you can see the third start is on the far left, the first start is on the far right, second day in the middle is in the middle. The vertical axis is corrected time deltas to the winner. So obviously there are some very large corrected time differences, but Transpac is a long race. This might better be expressed as percentage of elapsed time, but this is what we chose to do. You can see that on the far left, that blue zigzag line, which shows the differences to Westerly, which was the winner in Group 2, they're up pretty high, 40, 65, 25, on up to 80 hours difference. When we use forecast TCF, we're using an HRRR file that recognized that the day 3 starters got the short end of things. And you can see how much it dropped them down to the point that Pyewacket, I think she ended up second in fleet if we had been using FTCF rather than, I don't even know what the number was, but the corrected time delta looks on the chart about 27 hours. So looking at this, it became kind of a no-brainer that this is a huge improvement. You can also see that the starters from day 1 on the far right, they got helped a little bit as well compared to day 2. So let's go to the next slide. This is the Bermuda race from 24, which actually did use FTCF. If you look at the screen on the left, you'll see what looks very familiar. It's a graph showing the start, the run line from Bermuda down to, from Newport down to Bermuda. I ran the boat in 2 batches just in case something happened, so half the fleet is shown. And the bulk of the fleet is going a little bit west of the rum line. Why? Because you don't see this on the West Coast, but that's the Gulf Stream, and those are very powerful currents. You can look at the large arrows in the green and yellow area and see there's a very strong push favoring the fleet down towards Bermuda. So everyone was following that for the most part. There were other strategies as to what to do when you got out, but it was very clear what happened. So in terms of evaluating FTCF for this particular race, I'm showing on the right a graph of corrected times. I've plotted the boat twice. The blue is using FTCF and the red is using performance curve scoring, the methodology that has been used for years. PCS uses a statistical model built in. It happens to do a different solution for each wind speed, and then performance curve scoring PCS is just a way of smoothly putting a curve through the ratings across wind speed and then interpolating that curve to come up with the condition that looks like your boat has. And every boat has their own, what we call implied wind, and that really determines who does well. But it's just a statistical model based on years of observation. And I would actually like to thank Stan and some of the other folks on the West Coast, because the statistical model that was used was based on a similar approach that we did in coming up with the Transpac. We ran a fleet through many histories using optimal routing, histories of winds over the years, to come up with a statistical model of that combination of wind speeds and wind angles, like Jim Antrim was showing about an hour ago. Okay, so we got a bunch of blue scattered squares and a bunch of red diamonds. Obviously, some boats do really well and they have low corrected times, and some boats don't, as in any race. But what's really being illustrated here is the slope of the line. So I've included a trend line, which isn't a perfect way of showing things because it can be wiggled around. But with this number of boats, I think we're getting a pretty clear indication that the blue dotted line, the trend line, is basically horizontal, which means there's no real benefit to being fast or slow. Forgive me, I didn't explain the horizontal axis here. That's the Newport Bermuda 12 knot seconds per mile rating, which is that statistical one. I'm only using that as a separator. Fast boats on the left, 300 seconds a mile, to slow boats on the right, and the scale goes up to 600 seconds a mile. I could have used LWL or LOA just to stretch the boats out, but I think it's much more logical to use a prediction of their boat speed to do so. So again, like I said, the blue dotted line is basically horizontal. So there's no real bias shown in favor of fast versus middle versus slow boats. PCS, on the other hand, shows a very strong bias in favor of the slow boats. Why? Because of the presence of the Gulf Stream. Being slow, the boost that they got from that current was a greater percentage of their inherent boat speed. So they got a lot of push from that on a percentage basis. PCS doesn't know anything about the Gulf Stream. It's just a statistical wind model. So not being aware of that, it turned over the victory to the slow boats. So in my reanalysis of Newport Bermuda, in which I did the other classes as well and the whole fleet, I think it was very fortuitous that they followed the lead of other developments in looking at using FTCF. Because if they had not done it, once again, the rule would be blamed for favoring slow boats, when it's really a mismatch of the polars used for the handicap and the polars that people were sailing during the race. We go to the next one, please. This is the Marion Bermuda race this year. There is no highly favorable current. You can see the trajectories of the boats on the left. There is a Gulf Stream, but there's no strong meander that's going north-south, except if you look below the Gulf Stream, which is highlighted with the red and the strong arrows going from west to east, you can see everyone drifting off to the side, to the west of the run line. There was, in that green area there, a favorable current. Now, Expedition is not going to weigh risk versus reward. It's just going to find the fastest way to go there. And what was lurking in that area was a high system, the infamous Bermuda High, which just sucks all the air out for those that are in it, and they can come to our virtual stop. But the high was predicted to stay west of the trajectories of all those boats, so they went there to capture that little green area you can see, which is a nice boost down. There is a boat on the far right. I don't remember whose name it was. The blue trajectory. They went off to the east and got a lot of kind of diagonal push from the Gulf Stream, and they were able to work their way back. So I don't remember which boat that was. Well, unfortunately, if you look to the right, I think it's very clear. This is zoom in to about 60% of the 65% of the way through the race. This is a windy plot overlaid on the course, and you can see there's no wind on that blue oblong area that stretches horizontally east and west quite a bit with not a lot of north-south depth. Well, that is the Bermuda High. And I ran this through Yellowbrook and showed you a number of the boats approaching this. And as you can expect, they all got slowed down by this. Now, FTCF, our weather forecast, like I said, didn't think the high was going to drift across the course. And that's why all those boats on the graph on the left were able to go over there. I guess the good news is the high stretched all the way across before the first boat got there. So it was every boat had to sail through this. So there was no great benefit. I could show you a slide from the 22 Newport Bermuda race where the first 5 boats got by the high, then it slipped across and stopped everyone, and all the slow boats caught up. The high dissipated and everyone reached in. We can imagine the second tier fast boats, not among the first 5, got totally shafted by that weather pattern because there's no way that they could create their time allowances over the boats that were a little bit slower, and the little bit slower boats couldn't create their time allowances over the boats a little bit slower than them, all the way down to the slowest boat in the fleet. So other than those first 5 boats, if you were to plot the corrected time, you have a very highly sloped, skewed plot favoring the slow boats. Let's move on. Next slide. I'd like to anticipate a discussion we might be having by showing some of my initial analysis of this year's Transpac race. I'm comparing some information from day 1 fleet and the day 2 fleet. So the horizontal axis for both of those is the Transpac default rating. Again, that is the one that appears on your certificate, and it's based on that statistical analysis using optimal routing of a small fleet over many years of ratings. Stan and I ran it, and Alan and Andrews and I massaged it all into a table, accommodations of wind angle and wind speed with probabilities assigned to them. So that horizontal axis is what would have been used 2 years ago, with that logic. The vertical axis is the FTCF from this year's race. And what I want you to notice right away is that on the day 1 starters, their FTCFs are actually slower than their Transpac defaults, meaning that the weather that Expedition saw them seeing was slower than the weather built into the statistical model. If we go to the day 2 starters, our fleet bifurcates into 2 groups. Those that are slightly slower than the forecast TCF, than the statistical model or the default, and those that are quite a bit faster. I think you could probably anticipate what those boats were, but I'll leave that to the Q&A if the Q ever comes up. So that's where I'm going to finish with my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Well, we're making pretty good time.
We have 2 questions in the Q&A. Do you want me to read them, or can you see them as well?
I think reading them is probably a good idea. Let me why don't we go into the Q&A portion now? And if there are any lessons that people want to talk about, we can do that as part of it. And we're going to bring into the discussion, to the extent that they want to participate, 3 other members from our technical committee, Julia Paxton, David Rogers, and Rebecca Hinden. So, Stan.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention that I saw that Jim Kornman is on this call, and I'd like to thank Jim Kornman because a lot of the analysis that Jim Teeters and I have worked on for decades in terms of working out average and working out statistical weather for the different races on both coasts have been dependent on the historical weather data that Jim has captured and made available through his SailDocs activity. So again, thanks, Jim, for all of that. You've moved the sport forward around the world, and I think ORC is actually doing something similar. But again, the reason that both of the major rating systems are now considering this kind of thing is because of the analysis we're able to do with historical data.
Okay, so why don't we do, there's one question that relates to slide 24. So do you want to go back to that and I'll read it? And the question is, can you review slide 24 and explain why you think that forecast DCF made the spread of adjusted elapsed times less?
Yes, I think we can look at the boats on the left, which are the day 3 starters, Pelagroso on through the 72s and the sleds. You can see that they, now I wasn't there, and there are other people that did participate in the race that can speak with much more authority on what the conditions were like. But my understanding is that it was slow.
Yeah.
Well, if we use HRRR for that day, it showed slowness, whatever that, I presume it was light wind, maybe it was also a bad direction, but from my perspective, let's assume it's light wind. So day 3 started in light wind or slow conditions. The statistical model is unaware of that. It was put in place months before. The rating was on certificates all season long. So it's ignorant of what the actual weather is. It just knows what the average is. Well, day 3 starters didn't get the average weather. They got a really slow start. If we use HRRR and we use Expedition Optimal Routing, the routing software has them going very slow for the first whatever hours of the race. So their optimal elapsed time is going to be slow because there was no way to get around that weather system coming off the beach. So that is the beauty of having this whole approach of using weather forecasts, as long as the weather forecasts are better, as Dan said, than not using them. And it doesn't have to be a great forecast to be better than assuming that every day is the same no matter what. So again, just to recap, the HRRR showed there was very light, slow conditions. For the optimal routing through Expedition had them going slowly. Their total elapsed time to Hawaii included the increase in time due to starting off very slowly. So because your predicted elapsed time is used to come up with the FTCF, their larger elapsed time gave them a slower rating. I hope that explains or answers the question adequately.
Okay, let me go to the next one. So is the Pacific swell factor the same on every race, or does it change with the course and or the year? How big a percentage is the impact on of the Pacific swell factor on a race like Transpac or Pac Cup?
The Pacific swell factor in its first iteration was created by Dan Nolan, a member of the Transpac community, to recognize that some boats get helped with a following sea and others do not, and they get helped by different amounts. And Dan used some simple formulas that included things like sail area length and displacement. which kind of reminds me of what Jim Antrim was talking about earlier today. Then about 12, 15 years ago, we put in something that was based a little bit more on some scientific data and a scientific approach. Again, the purport of it is to estimate how much of a boost different kinds of boats will get from having a following sea. So it's based on, let me back up. I mentioned earlier that we create an expedition file that has the Pacific swell factor in it. The push that you get is a function of the wind speed and the wind angle. So yes, your FTCF, your weather forecast, because in theory, even for a race like this, is going to have different combinations of what the wind is, speed and direction. The net effect of the Pacific swell factor will correlate right along with whatever combinations you get. So it is sensitive to the weather forecast. Yes. Good question, by the way. I like that one.
Okay.
Bob, there was a request to see whether we could post the question on the screen so that people can see that while they get the answer from our panelists. I don't know whether that's
I
easy
don't,
or hard to do.
I don't know how to do that. Corey?
I don't think that's what Carl was asking for. He wants people to, when they post them in chat, to also post them in the Q&A so that we'll notice them.
Oh,
Right,
we're monitoring both, but that's fine. Okay, sorry.
right. So, here, so this is a long one. Let me read it. I appreciate the description why the start day forecast needs to be used, i.e. people need to know how they are doing. I agree with this, but I think there's a possibility to use the weather forecast / hindcast from a midday race, perhaps the start of the fastest boat or midway slowest boats, that would reduce the effect of a very long range forecast having a large effect. In my experience, racers do not need to know where they stand in the race, but may tolerate some uncertainty in the first few days if they fail to make it fair. I understand that this introduces a different amount of forecast versus hindcast for various starts, but I am interested in people's thoughts as approach is relatively new in the Hawaiian race. Thank you.
Stan, go ahead.
Yeah, the question is a good one, and the question is, is quite insightful because it's asking for a compromise. And actually, Jim Teeters and I have kicked around a compromise approach where you start with the FTCF number and then you adjust it a little bit, as the race goes on, to take advantage of the historical weather for the from the start day to the current time that more accurately using reanalysis or H0 data, and then the increasingly good forecast for the rest of the race. The problem with that is complexity. It's hard enough to explain FTCF, and I imagine, and it'd be even harder to explain that approach. And I think it's worth the cautionary tale is we did try H0 scoring on a couple of races. We tried it on the return race from Bermuda. And the H0 scoring is one where you score the race after everybody gets in using the H0 data, which is the data that NOAA has estimated happened in the past using the initialization run for every model run, the initialization slot for every model run. And the problem with that approach is that it works well in terms of fairly rating the race, but the sailors hate it. It's just awful to race in that situation because you feel like you're sailing by yourself. You can't race against other boats. The J class, this is the big, 140-foot J's. They had an approach that was similarly, cosmic science, but they had to get data from every boat. The navigators had to upload all the data, and an hour after the race, they would finally figure out what the results were, and it destroyed the class. People just hated the approach of not being able to race during the race and be able to figure out who to cover and when to split. So I think I think that's the trade-off. The disadvantage of that approach is that it's more complicated and even harder to explain, and that sailors don't like not knowing. The advantage of that approach is that it's going to be more accurate, and you're going to get a more fairly scored race. And that's the trade-off. Is, do you want it to be super accurate and people hate it, or do you want it to accept the fact that the forecasts aren't perfect? But heck, it's sailboat racing. There is an element of luck in our sport, and the wind shifts, puffs happen, and that's part of the sport.
Thank you. The next one, it's not really related to ratings, but would the PACCUP ever consider a live yellow brick tracker? This was used in Transpac 2025 and made for some great boat racing. I think I can answer this. I think we will consider it, but probably not, doesn't need to be discussed tonight. But we'll bring that to the technical committee. And then the next question is, for two systems, ORR and PHRF, certified and not, what is the cost all up, time to get all up, or any deadlines to be considered, effort needed by the entrant, and a few bullets on the process to get these ratings? And you might poll today's attendees if they have ORR, PHRF, or no rating experience.
Before we get into the answer, let me suggest a methodology for coming up with rough numbers for people. I'd like to bring Rebecca Hinden in to tell us about the comparative costs of weighing and measuring for a PHRF certified downwind rating versus the weighing and measuring process for a boat that is not yet rated under ORR. And then I guess I'd like Jim Antrim and Jim Teeters to weigh in on what the comparative application fees are for the two systems. Rebecca, is that a fair thing to ask from you?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So for ORR, there's kind of a couple separate things you have to pay for. You have to pay for your certificate. Jim Teeters can speak to the cost of that. And you also have to pay for measurement, usually, unless you've already got a cert. The costs can vary, but for, say a 32-foot boat, that's a one design, or like a very common boat, you're probably looking at $800-900 to get measured. If you have a custom boat, it can get more expensive because there's a cost associated with getting your offset file, which is like a 3D model of the boat, into the ORR system. There's a couple ways to go about this. The most accurate is to get a laser scan, which can run you, I hesitate to actually give it a number, but it increases the cost, probably doubles the cost. So hopefully that's helpful.
And what about on the PHRF side?
On the PHRF side, if you're going with certified PHRF, you of course have to pay for your cert. And then you also have to pay to get weighed and overhangs taken. I think that runs about like $300 right now. And so certainly cheaper, but may not always be so if we can't weigh boats at Berkeley Marine Center for some reason. So right now we have sort of a very cheap way of weighing boats, relatively speaking, due to the generosity of Berkeley Marine Center, essentially. But that might not always be the case, but it should be for this year. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
So Jim A and Jim T, how do the application fees differ?
Well, in PHRF, I think it's a flat $100 to get a certificate. for the year, and you can make whatever changes you want without expense, as long as it fits the time slot of the race entry.
Great.
Okay, this is Jim Teeters, and ORR, there's a fee that is a function of the length of the hull. Does not include spritz or whatever. So it's also a progressive fee. I think in Transpac, the smallest boat certificate was under $300. And you don't want to know what the most expensive boat was. If you have a boat of that size, you're probably not concerned about the cost anyway, is my answer. I think most of the boats were 4 or 5, and some of the bigger boats 600, and the biggest ones like a Rio 100 who did not participate this year are more than that.
Okay.
I can add one more thing to that, which is with your ORR rating, you also get polars that you can plug into Expedition, which if you don't already have, it can be very useful. It's not going to be perfect, but it's certainly a good starting point.
Great.
So there was another question that seems to be gone, but I'll sort of paraphrase it. Because I've heard this from several other people. If you have an ORC rating, then what's involved in getting an ORR rating?
It depends on what kind of ORC rating you have. As an ORR, ORC has 2 levels. There's fully measured, which they call an ORC International Certificate, and there's an ORC Club, which in reality, nothing needs to be measured. The hull can be a reasonable estimate that was created by my office or someone else. Obviously, we like to have as much rig information as we can. And let me back up. We do require sale certificates for ORC clubs. So if we don't take a statement from the owner or the boat captain, they have to be fully measured sales. So for ORR, if you are doing Pac Cup, we can make a direct transfer from ORCI to ORR, ORCI being the international fully measured one. There are a couple little bits of data that are not collected for ORCI that are used for ORR and vice versa. But it's for most boats, you're 99% there with an ORC certificate, ORCI certificate.
Yeah, we have a lot of boats from the Pacific Northwest this year that many of them have ORC ratings.
I imagine most of those are club ratings, or would you know?
I don't know.
Okay, well, I'm not going to speculate then.
Right. Good. Okay, so I think Jim's question, I think we answered the one that's left. So
There's
All
a,
right.
Bob, there's a great question that's been hanging out in the chat, which I think Jim can answer pretty quickly.
okay.
What assumptions or inputs are used in the routing solutions regarding topics such as tack and jibe loss, polar percentage performance, upwind, downwind at night? Are these different for different sizes and or types of boats? And this is a question that I think a lot of us ask when we're doing our expedition. So Jim, what do you put any special sauce on the numbers, or do you use straight polars?
That's actually a very good question because the polars that you see on an OR certificate include the effects of tacking and jibing and other effects as well. It's something called a dynamic allowance. It's really was developed in the late 1990s on into the 2000s by the International Technical Committee of the ORC. At the time, David Pedrick was chairman. He and Alessandro Nazareth of Italy led the charge. So ORR uses a variant of that original dynamic allowance. So it's worth explaining what it originally was. It was taking non-dimensional parameters of those things that affect what happens dynamics. Dynamics means things are changing. You're not sailing at a steady state. The VPP itself is a steady state solution, meaning constant boat speed and no change in direction. here's what you can do in 10 knots of wind, sailing 52 degrees off the wind. It's a pure number calculated by the balance of forces and moments of aerodynamics and hydrodynamics. Well, in the real world, that's not all that happens on a race course, especially in short course racing where there are a lot of interactions between boats. You're coming off the line, someone gets on your air, you have to tack away. So you're doing a tack that you didn't want to do. You get hit by a wave. Now that will happen in any race. You have to bear off or whatever and get back up to speed. So the parameters that the ITC used were the ones that might help figure out what does it take to get back up to speed, not what predicts whether you're going to get slammed by someone, which is really unknowable. So what are the characteristics of a boat that gets back up to speed quickly? Well, a low displacement for their length, meaning less drag, more sail area for their length, meaning more drive, more stability, which means you can harness the wind to get that driving force, more draft and more stability, also particularly upwind in this case, help you get back up to speed after being knocked down or forced to tack or whatever. So we developed dynamic allowance. I honestly don't know what the ORC is doing. As the author of the, or handler of the ORR code, I'm obviously privy to that. Every wind angles and wind speed solution has a different factor. So your ability to get back up to speed depend not only the characteristics of the boat, but what the weather conditions are. And that is a factor that's applied to the polars. The polars that you see on a certificate have that dynamic allowance fully engaged, and another set of polars fully disengaged. That was new for ORR in 2025. There's 2 full sets of polars with and without dynamic allowance. So for the big offshore races like Transpac and Pacific Cup, there's very, very little of that dynamic allowance blended in, because we really don't think there's much boat-boat interaction. Stan.
Yeah, I'd just like to answer with you, Jim, another aspect of that question, which is if what you have done for the Transpac, which I think is exactly right, is you post all of the settings for expedition that we use. And those are settings that, you and I worked hard at coming up with, but, it's every setting all the way through. And those were the settings that that worked for us, that seemed to have expedition, reasonably accurately, predict the performance of boats, in historical weather. And then by posting all of those settings, people can, run the routes themselves. And if they have the same grid files, they can, recreate the data. Now, as it happens, there's, probably hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of calculations in a particular route. So that even when Jim and I have our computers set up exactly the same, we'll get slightly different route times. The deltas between the routes all stay, almost exactly the same. But nevertheless, Jim does post all of the settings for expedition so that people in principle can redo it themselves. And those settings include the actual grid files and then the extent of the grid files, meaning at what point does a boat sail off the edge of HRRR and then at that point revert to the GFS forecast. And that's something that I think Jim does and does very well to state the complete setup. And it's not necessarily the same as what I do, as a navigator, because I have my instrument set up differently, but it does work for the situation that Jim's in, where he's taking forecasts for 10-meter wind and using 10-meter polars. And not many people actually do that on the boat, but it works for the FTCF, and it can be recalculated by anybody that chooses to dig into it to that detail.
Okay, we have three current questions in the Q&A. One is, how expensive is an uncertified PHRF?
$100.
Okay. And then do you use minimum motor speed in the forecast TCF ratings?
We had a minimum speed of 3 knots. Yes. By the way, I was asked to check on the day 2 starters if anyone was being boosted up, and I didn't find a case in the logs where anyone got under 3 knots, but that is what we do.
Stan?
And in part, that to a reasonable extent reflects reality. That even, I mean, sailors are resourceful, and in the ocean, you know, if they have 0 knots of wind speed, you know, sailors will tee the boat up to slat, and it happens, but it's pretty rare that you actually stop, because sailors are pretty resourceful at going from cloud to cloud or setting the boat up to slat and sort of fan its way forward.
Okay, next question is, are ORR polar wind speeds in the cert calculated for the top of the mast of the certified boat, or are they the 10-meter wind speeds?
They're the 10-meter wind speed.
Okay,
When we issue a performance package, which some people order, I use a conversion using a vertical wind profile. So there's 2 sets of polars in there, and they are expressed as expedition files to be saved. But some of them are masthead, some are 10 meters, just to help people.
okay. And then the next question is, how long is a weighing and resultant certificate valid under each pack-up measurement rule? What circumstances would trigger the necessity of a new weighing and certificate, changed rudder, changed engine, changed mast, bigger sail?
Jim Antrim, you go first.
So how significant a change in any of those? You have to report any of those changes. And then we decide whether or not it changes the rating or not. But, any significant change in weight or keel or rudder or rig size all need to be reported to the,
Or sail
Wonder-
size.
yeah.
Definitely. And that's true both for PHF and ORR, so.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
so
or-
just specifically, they're asking about, I think, about weighing, but so I don't think, yeah, sail size would change your rating, but you wouldn't need to remeasure.
I think that one of the issues they might also be touching on is both we and Transpac have a time limit on how long that weighing is good for. And I think we're looking back 10, 11 years. And if it's older than that, it's time to get reweighed.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, boats tend to change, get heavier.
Yeah. Yeah, so do we all.
Yes. Or most of us.
I just have a small correction there. This is Rebecca. Not necessarily reweighed, but for ORR it would be remeasured. So you
Excellent
don't
point.
need to get weighed for your ORR rating.
Okay,
Good point.
And certificates are good for 1 calendar year, with a little bit of fudge for those in Southern California in January.
okay, and then the next one is I think it says we slow, but I think it means we sailboats sailed long periods at 1 knot of boat speed for the entire first day of the pack up.
Ah.
Yeah, I've done that too.
Yeah, me too.
Well, it looks like a good discussion item for how we implement FTCF for you.
Yes. And then we have for expedition settings you're using for fleet routing. I think I heard you say they're posted. Can you provide the link, please?
That was a protocol worked out with Transpac Race Committee. I think, I don't know where they posted it. I assume they have. I cannot verify that right now.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's been posted, but I just can't confirm it.
If Pat Cup does the same thing, and I that sounds like a great idea, that'll be posted on the race documents page in the website. But we're a long way from that right now.
Right.
And Transpac did post it, but as with Jim, I've seen it, but I can't I don't recall the URL.
Okay, well, that was the last question in the Q&A. There are a bunch of things in the chat, but so we still have one more set of slides, or am I mistaken?
I think we're done. I think people should know that they're welcome to look at the other slides. Jim Teeters in particular has 6 or 7 others that I think may be helpful for those who want to really dig in to how this has all worked so far. But I suspect that most of the people in our audience have reached absorption. And I would suggest that for those who want to follow up, we're all reachable. For the technical committee, I would suggest that emails go to Bob Hinden as Commodore. His email address is on the website, obviously, and I guess we can circulate email addresses for the rest of the people on the panel. If people have questions that they want to direct to particular individuals. So
Yeah.
I'd like to thank our speakers.
Can I jump in with one other there's one other question here.
All right.
What do you expect the number of boats racing in each category? It seems like a lot of people are going ORR. Will the PHRF fleet remain competitive with enough boats? I think my answer to that is it's still pretty early. We're like in the low 40s now. The numbers keep going up, so we'll have to see how it plays out later this year.
All right.
Sorry,
All right.
going
Great
Bucks.
job to our panelists, and thank you, the audience. Good questions. And I hope this has been helpful to you. And as I said, we're here to help answer questions that are leftovers or that occur to you.
And there is also an FAQ on the website on this topic that has information about some of the things that were asked here as well. So it's also a good reference
Yeah.
to check. But we're certainly, as Buzz said, very happy to answer all questions.
Maybe this has been covered, but are these slides going to be available for people to download or print or whatever?
We can certainly post them.
Yeah, well, once I get the final set back from Corey, I'll put them up on the knowledge base.
Great.
Good.
Also, next Thursday, we have a general session. We're not going to get in anywhere level of this detail, but it will be another opportunity to ask a few questions. That's the Consider the Possibilities webinar.
Yeah.
Great.
A lot of us will be there.
As
All right.
apparently, yeah.
Well,
Thanks,
good.
everybody. And have a good evening.
Thanks for
Thanks,
joining.
Bob.
All right.
Thanks to the panel.